Well, good afternoon. I certainly want to thank you all for being here and choosing this session, and thanks to Marcus Evans as well for allowing us to present about the disruption of agriculture. Quick introductions. I'm Duane Cantrell, Managing Partner of Fulcrum Global Capital. My partners over here are Kevin Locket, John Perry. They'll be chiming in when I misstate something here probably. But anyway, so anyway, so just want to make sure that we keep this very interactive. This is not intended to be a monologue, but a dialogue or discussion. So please stop me at any point in time. And I've kind of got it broken up into 4 sections. I will stop after each section to try to recap or ask questions. But anytime, certainly, stop and ask questions. And we have left you a document. I'm not following the document, but I may reference it a couple times. It's more of a, well, they call it a leave behind. I hope it's a take home document, but it's leave behind for us, to take home for you, I hope. So anyway, I saw by looking at your profiles, many of you have done some ag-related investing or have expressed an interest potentially in ag investing. So show of hands with the type of ag investing. So the investing you've done, has it been ag land, natural resources? Anybody done any investing in that area? Okay, some. Ag technology, things like drones, robotics, anything in that nature? Okay, oftentimes that gets tagged with an ag tech because technology is applied to agriculture. What about areas like urban farming, greenhouse, hydroponics, any of that type of investing? A little bit here and there. Okay. Are there other areas of ag investing that you have done that I didn't mention there? None. Okay. Good. Well, then we've got open ground to cover here. So, next question, I guess, really is: so, are there specific areas that you want to make sure that I try to address in this 30 to 40 minutes we have together to make sure I'm covering your particular needs or wants or interests? Okay.
Free reign.
Free reign. All right, good. Well, they may regret that one, right, guys? So,
free range chicken.
yeah. So we're going to break this up into 2 or 4 different buckets, and first is just kind of the global food crisis. Oftentimes we don't think about that in this part of the world too much because we left a lot of food sitting in the other room at lunchtime, and there's plenty of food sitting out in the break area and stuff, but it's not so much today as what's coming ahead of us from a global perspective. So we're going to focus, and so what we're doing currently in food production just isn't adequate is the point. All right, we've got a lot more to do in the next 30 plus years, but we can't wait 30 years to do it. Those things need to happen and start happening now. So we're going to focus on 3 areas in our discussion about the disruption of agriculture. One is food yield or production. In other words, how much are we producing? Then we're going to get to food waste, and we're going to get to food safety as kind of those 3 areas that we think start to define the food crisis in the areas that need some concentration and focus. So it is generally understood and very little deliberation on the fact that over the next 30 years, as one Nobel laureate, Norman Borlaug, who's kind of, if you're in the ag space, everyone talks about Norman Borlaug, he says, we'll have to produce more food in the next 30 years than the previous 10,000 years of mankind. So if that doesn't get your attention a little bit, think of it this way, that we have to increase our current levels of food production, have to increase by 70% in that same time frame. So as productive as we are globally, we've got to improve that by 70%. And that current level production means that 1 in 10 people currently don't have adequate food today, right? So we are about 10% of the population doesn't have enough food. We've got to increase that 70%.
Excuse me, is that globally? Or
This is
this is
global. Yeah, all this is a global, and I'll try to differentiate. Thank you for your clarifying question. When it's a North America or global issue, but most of this will be a global discussion. So we have to do this, have this increase in ag production with less land, less arable land, less water, and less labor, right? And so all 3 of those factors would work against increasing yield and production worldwide. And so, and we also have to do it with less antibiotics, less chemically based pesticides, fertilizers, soil nutrients. Everything we do today is very much chemically based. That is clearly being pushed back against by consumers and EPA and all kinds of other organizations. So we think about the future with the things that have been normal yield stimulants probably not be available to us in the next 30 years or some point in time. The World Economic Forum just published its 2018 Global Risk Report, and they look at things from both a magnitude of impact and a likelihood or probability. And food crisis, along with water crisis, and those two go hand in hand, are both impact above average. The only thing more likely to happen in a risk world are things like global economic or ecosystem collapse, cybersecurity attacks, or natural disasters. So that's the only thing kind of to the right of food crisis and water crisis, right? So whether you trust the three of us saying this, there are other sources of this is a crisis that is a global crisis and a global issue that needs to be addressed. And so, why is this? Why do we have this need for increasing our food supply by 70%? Well, first and foremost is that there are global kind of demographic and social economic shifts that are going on that are part of this. The reality is we will continue to procreate, right? So we're growing population at a rate faster than our mortality rate. So population is growing. Every morning when each of us wake up, and that's true of anybody, we wake up with the need and desire to eat, right? In some cases, once, 2, 3, 4 times a day. So that makes the ag sector somewhat impervious to economic trends, global economic issues, market realities, because population is going to grow and people are going to need and want to eat. So again, most estimates put the 2050 global population at 9.5 billion to 9.7 billion. That's 6.5 billion today. Therefore, that's part of the increase in food production that's necessary. You combine that with what's been a 150-year trend. 150 years ago, most of the world's population was an agrarian population base. Today, it's an urban population base. And not only is that migration continuing, it's actually accelerating. So you see an acceleration, which means less labor in the agriculture parts of the world. And so it's also shifting greatly population centers in the world. If I asked a question 10 years ago, the largest populations, we'd say New Delhi and Shanghai and Guangzhou and New York and whatever. 2050, the largest city in the world will be Lagos, Nigeria, right? No one thinks about what's happening in those parts of the world, and so, but that's where the population shifts are going and the urbanization that's going on. You add to that, so we have population growth, you have urbanization going, and the third component here is that there's a rising global middle class, and that rising global middle class is demanding more proteins and shifts in their diets and changes in their diet. So the migration from grains, from rice to beans, corn, wheat, but also demands for animal protein, from milk, which we don't always think about as an animal protein, but milk, fish, poultry, swine, beef, and the complexity of people's demands for that diet is changing dramatically, and those will increase. So overall, yields got to go up by 70% with less resources to do it and less enhancements under the current chemically based enhancements. So that moves us to food waste. So food waste, so we have to increase yield by 70%. And now this is the point. North America, food waste is on an annual basis 35%. 35% of all the food we produce, we don't consume. And that number is actually going up, not down. Now, there are certain things you can't do at the point of consumption, but there are a lot of things that can be done prior to the point of consumption that can be addressed through technologies, et cetera. And so now you compare that to the continent of Africa, where it's estimated 80% of the food produced in Africa is not consumed. 20% never gets out of the field. Labor issues, inadequate supply chain, civil war, strife, all kinds of things. But the bottom line is, so if we can take somehow and cut the waste, even the U.S. waste, in half, we start to make a big dent into that 70%. But waste is a major issue that we have to deal with. But you have, even in advanced economies, inadequate supply chains, old technology when it comes to moving products in the ag sector as compared to about any other sector of our economy. So even in advanced economies, we have inadequate supply chain and logistics systems. The third area is food safety. So last year, 2017, about $5 billion worth of product was recalled, food was recalled last year in North America alone. That's just North America. And so you may have heard of Tyson's 1 million pounds of chicken nuggets that were recalled in the middle of last year, okay? So you start looking at the recalls, and there's two primary primary causes of recalls. It's a foreign object contamination, glass, metal, grease, plastic, whatever, and or microbial pathogen, E. coli, salmonella types of reasons for recall. Now, we've just gotten through lunch, and you got a few hours before dinner. You won't worry quite as much, but you'll forget some of this. But so this will probably scare you to death. So the current methods of detection of foreign objects, state of the art in food processing facilities in North America, is visual and X-ray. X-ray picks up what? Metal. Doesn't pick up glass, plastic, grease, rubber, anything else. So all those other contaminants, you're based on a 15-hour an hour worker sitting at a line going 140 feet per minute processing line, trying to pick up pieces of glass or whatever, and so a lot of it doesn't get picked up, right? And that's the state-of-the-art technology. There are technologies out there that we believe and are looking at that can change that dramatically. If you think that one's scary, as you get to the microbial part, so the current method of detecting pathogens in our food and the processing stage it's called a swab system. So every time you stop a line of production, you swab the drain, you swab part of the conveyor system, you swab that for a culture. You put it in a bag, it goes off to a laboratory. 3 days later, if their culture is built, you know whether or not you have E. coli, salmonella, whatever. Meantime, 3 days of production have gone by. And the only way to recall is those 3 days are obvious, but then you have to figure out when did I have the exact same swab location that was a clean location, etc. And therefore recalls, therefore waste is, so it's a safety issue, but we're also wasting a lot of food because of those inadequate systems. So there are technologies again today that we are looking at that are based upon different technologies, DNA, rapid diagnostic DNA test that can give you less than 60-minute in-plant readings on whether or not you have a pathogen issue or not. And so those are the type of things that not only reduce the waste, but increase the safety of food that's immediate. And so you look at those so it's not just in Tyson's case, the cost of the 1 million pounds of chicken nuggets. They ship those to grocery stores, McDonald's, restaurants, etc. So there's a layered impact of brand equity that's being affected. We all heard about the Chipotle issues twice in the last 5 years because of organic-based meat, etc. So there is an effect that's beyond the $5 billion in recall that's real. And so let me stop there on the food yield and production side. Are there questions about either yield, safety, or waste? Yes, sir.
Couple things. When you say, we are looking at this technology, are you talking about you as portfolio managers, or are you talking about, say, I guess the FDA or the USDA?
It's all the above. There's certainly, there are certainly funds like ourselves, and that's not the point of this discussion,
Right,
are looking at those things. But it's the industry in total. USDA certainly concerned about all of these areas as well. FDA gets involved in some level, but it really is a USDA issue for the most part. So it's an industry perspective.
As an example, in the food processing industry, they have all determined, this is all the big processors, right? So think of Maple Leaf, Tyson, Cargill, et cetera. They've all determined that food safety is a non-competitive issue. So if one plant finds something that works, then let's introduce it to all the other plants. So it's not a competitive issue of, hey, we want to be safer than someone else. it's across the board. It's non-competitive.
And that's pretty unique in any industry, as you can imagine. You don't find those things in technology and other areas, but in the food, it's the food safety issues. People's lives are at stake. And so, but it's a good thing though as well.
A quick question on production. From a production standpoint, you mentioned Lagos, Africa.
Mhm.
How far behind? I imagine South Africa is more advanced than other parts of the continent.
Right.
But I mean, are they 20 years behind us, 30 years behind us?
Hard to put a number, but having spent a little time there, I would say it's at least 20 to 25 years in many cases. And that's the advantage. I would
So
say
wouldn't that mitigate some of the yield process if they could catch up technologically?
it would, but you got to introduce those technologies, existing technologies, but also leapfrog that forward to get them even. So to get them from where they are today to current will be a huge help, right? But if you can take and leap them all the way to where these technologies might affect global impact, then you move that even further yet. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay.
It does.
The challenge with Africa, not to get into Africa geopolitics, is it's hard to monetize anything in Africa. I mean, it really is a challenge getting. So who pays for all this? There isn't the private sector, the government sectors, or even the best ones are challenging at times and stuff. So it is a challenge. Other questions on yield, whether it be waste or production, or yes, sir.
Just in relation to perhaps a reversal of the trends towards globalization, like this is clearly a global issue.
Right.
And yet, what I see in the industry is quite a bit of emphasis on local production.
Right.
And knowing your sources. And so what's kind of the state of affairs in your view right now?
Sure. Well, I think that there is, you're absolutely right, that there are multiple trends. So you're seeing this. That's why I asked earlier if the people had done investing in urban farming and hydroponics and those, because you're seeing this very localized, kind of farm to table kind of mindset. And I would say that it clearly works in advanced economies like ours, North America, but also has application. Certainly, if you look at greenhouse hydroponics and things like that in developing countries, a starting point, right? So you're not having to waste through inefficient supply chain systems because it's right there. And so I think it's working at this really from both ends. There are big disruptive technology applications, and there's this localized production that has to be a part of the solution as well.
So just transplant those systems?
In many cases,
Yeah.
but there are, again, I want to get into, but we were talking to a group out of LA that's, I call it the Lego system to greenhouse farming. And they really figured out how to kind of plug in the next one. And I think that's a remarkable application, not just to United States or North America, but the application of that in parts like China, Africa, has huge implications and stuff.
And part of it also is the idea that there's less arable land, right? So trying to figure out different ways to grow foods and using sort of inside type environments that are.
Yes, sir.
So I'm in Oregon, and we're very farm to table.
Yes.
Is it enough of a movement though? To bringing that kind of localized.
Oh no! I said it has to be both.
It's not
They're
disruptive
happy.
enough.
It's not disruptive, but it will solve a problem, a part of the problem, but it won't be. It's nowhere near enough. We got to have broad-based row crop. Big production kind of disruption for it to really solve those kind of problems, absolutely.
Is that movement growing though?
Yes, we think pretty significantly, but I don't think we've seen it quite yet in the marketplace, which I'll get to in a moment. But there really is some dynamics, and so one thing is we have a food crisis. The next is what's going on in the marketplace, right? And then we'll get to kind of solutions that I think that are part of that. So hang on to that question. I think it's a great question. But let me move then to the second part of this, which is kind of market dynamics. And I'll be very, very brief in this section, is that so if ag needs to be disrupted because there's a food crisis, then it also needs to be disrupted and now because there's also current market realities. And that's just this mega merger and acquisition and consolidation that's going on. So you look at Bayer's acquisition of Monsanto, which will be wrapped up here, we think, shortly. Look at 2017, Boehringer Ingelheim's acquisition of Mariel. You look at Chem China acquiring Syngenta. You look at Dow DuPont. These mega mergers that are going on in this animal health ag space, these are all major players in the ag space, are causing several things. One of which is that R&D budgets are getting slashed pretty dramatically as part of the synergy of a major acquisition, but just driving these corporations to look to do really two things. That's the identification and acquisition of new sources of technology, which would lead to new sources of revenue. And in terms of being internally developed, as they get bigger, that's hard to do sometimes. So they're looking to buy those technologies and buy those revenue streams. But also you're seeing the emergence of these corporations creating their own venture funds. So you see Tyson Ventures got launched last year. Monsanto Ventures been around for a few years. Mariel has its own venture. Eli Lilly, you can go down the list. These big major animal health ag companies are creating their own venture organizations to put, instead of putting money into R&D, they're putting money into how do we acquire and ask these technologies and revenues. The opposite end of that, over the last 30 months, $500 million has gone in at the seed and angel level into ag sector investment. So you have this consolidation on the one end with creation of venture funds and reduction of R&D. On the other end of the scale, you have this $500 million of seed and angel funding into the ag sector. And that really is a North American number only. So you have what's happening is this kind of bipolar kind of dynamics going on, which if you're in the venture space, that is, you're ripe for opportunities as you look at that from a venture perspective. So it's very, very brief, but any questions about kind of the market dynamics? Kevin, John, anything to add? No. All right, so I want to get to solutions. So as really, I think the question you were getting at a moment ago is that, so we see disruptive technologies being market-based. This is not academic. This is very operational, very practical, solving the billion-dollar problems, not just to the very question of, is that sufficient? Is localized farming and farm-to-market mentality sufficient? And the answer is no. There has to be a significant, but they're part of it, but there has to be a significant investment in technologies that make it different. So the food crisis is a global crisis. It's a global need. But solutions, we believe, will predominantly surface out of North America for several reasons. One, it's the highest production per acre, yield per head of cattle, swine, whatever. So we produce at a higher rate through existing technologies and existing systems than anywhere else in the world. One. Two, that I also think is we look at this concentration of animal health companies, ag companies, research in the ag and animal health space. There's no other place in the world than the United States or North America where this concentration of research, of commerce goes on than in North America. Plus we have, the production and yield lead. So I think the world looks at North America as being the place where most of this is going to get solved. You look at companies, China's largest animal health company does not currently have a presence in, have a presence in North America. They just signed a lease on a new facility in actually all places in Manhattan, Kansas. They don't make the top 10 in animal health globally, but they're China's largest, right? And so they're trying to find access to new technologies, new vaccines, new therapeutics. So we see that the world kind of looking at North America for solutions to this, but technologies that improve crop and animal yields, analytics that allow for production optimization, the capabilities to diagnose, detect, predict, and treat disease. Those are all things that will become important parts of the solution. And so one of the things you might look at, there's 3 pages in here that look kind of like these market maps. There's 3 straight pages. I'm going to just touch on some of that, but it gives you a sense of the areas of opportunity that exist, we think, from a technology perspective. So let's talk about ag for a second, agriculture. Things that we see important, so clearly bio-based stimulants, soil stimulants, bio-based fertilizers, sustainable pesticides. All those things are part of the ag future that get us away from chemical-based solutions today. Gene traits that deal with drought resistance. So there's a lot of talk about GMO and et cetera, but the reality of it is Kevin or John says all the time, until you have priced in little water or priced in no food, we'll get a little bit more less sensitive maybe about these things. The reality of it is, every child we produce is a GMO, right? So GMO's been going on in mankind from the beginning, but we've got some issue with how it gets interpreted, and we get association, and maybe very well true, with gluten resistance and autoimmune issues, et cetera, that are arising, but there's hard science to really connect those from our perspective. But the consumer is demanding it nonetheless. So we have to be sensitive to those things. But the reality of it is, with less water, less land, et cetera, we're going to have to find ways to grow crops with bigger production, with less water, and that's going to come in some form of gene traits like drought resistance. Extended shelf life. If you look about the food that's thrown away at grocery stores, and produce and vegetables and fruit, for example, is just massive because it's got a speck here or there or whatever. Well, there are technologies out there that are working towards extending shelf life without degrading the quality, without changing the quality and nutrient value of that product and stuff. And so another area in the ag sector is just kind of biomass use. So biomass, for those who aren't from the Midwest maybe, or the ag areas, so when you harvest a field, you've got what you might call it field stubble. Well, that stubble that's left, there's still nutrients, right? There are still values and properties in that. We got to turn it over and churn it oftentimes. But there's work being done, not just in like ethanols, bioethanols, but now into bioplastics, bioelastomer plastics. Because the values that are there in corn, particularly for creating elastic polymers as opposed to chemical plastic polymers, is a significant opportunity. So there's all kinds of ways of looking at waste in a way that can be additive to not necessarily improving the food situation, but it helps improve kind of the waste side of all this. But it's opportunities for investment in the ag space. In the animal health space, we see obviously antibiotic alternatives being a big part of what has to become a major part of this industry's focus. Rapid and portable animal and plant pathogen diagnostics. So, for example, we look at, so take the dairy industry, for example. The biggest issue of dairy waste and safety is something called mastitis. It's a pathogen inside that comes in milk. And so we wipe out, I think it's $2 billion a year of North American milk gets thrown away because of mastitis. The global number's not known, but most estimates are $8 to $12 billion a year of milk. It's one of the animal proteins that has at the early stage of demand for animal protein. So you look at that and say, well, how do you not wipe out an entire week's production or whatever of milk at a dairy farm? Well, the reality of it is, we know today, is that mastitis is, if you can isolate it to the actual cow. And by the way, mastitis, for the most part, an udder has 4 contained quadrants. It's not one, it's 4. And mastitis is usually resident in one of those quadrants. So we're throwing away an entire production facility's milk over maybe one quadrant of one cow. So talk about inline dairy diagnostics. So you take a milking machine onto one teat of the udder, and you can instantly pick up that preclinical indicator. You can isolate not just the cow, you can isolate the quadrant of the udder of the cow and take that $12 billion issue and reduce it. And what have you just done? You've increased animal protein dramatically because of the access to healthy and good dairy. So that's just one example. Feed additives, alternative novel delivery systems for vaccination. So for those who may not have been around feedlots or whatever, every time you corral a cow in a feedlot and you restrain, or what they call chute, you put the cow's head in a chute for a vet to come treat it, they go into stress. And what happens when you stress out a production animal is their yield does this, right? When it does this, you got to gain that back, which means you just increase your food cost because you got to regain all that. And it takes a longer time to get that cow now to the production facility, processing facility.